We're not only dreaming at night. I think that's one of the things that not very much of contemplative introspection shows you. And it's often kind of, if you've never, in the beginning, it's kind of unsettling. Like, good Lord, I'm not just dreaming at night. My mind's dreaming right now. Right? It's endlessly talking to itself. Right? And sometimes the way it talks to itself seems to be completely disconnected to anything that's happening right now. It's just sort of endlessly da 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 da, right? And then of course it feels what it's saying, so it brings your body along for the trip, And there you are, and you think, yes, I'm very conscious, I'm a spiritual person, and I'm meditating, and and you think, well, I'm not dreaming, right? And then you look closely, and you're like, oh, yes, I am. Right? I'm both not dreaming and I am dreaming. So we encounter that underlying level at which our minds are almost constantly in this dream. So much of our narrative it's just like your dream in the middle of the night. It's trying to work things out, things you felt, things you experienced, things you heard, and you don't know how it's doing it because it's just sort of often sounds like just unconnected, self-talk. And we do have an instinct towards greater consciousness. Maybe that's the simplest way to put it. An instinct towards greater consciousness. And that's much more than it sounds like. Like, that's interesting, greater consciousness. Like, okay, great. You find that in any spiritual magazine you open up, greater consciousness. And we imagine greater consciousness is sort of, primarily concerned with, okay, if I'm having a sip of water, am I actually conscious of what I'm doing? Okay, that's where it begins. And we find out, like usually when I have a drink of water, I'm basically unconscious of it. Just of the very surface, like something kind of comes up to my lips and I swallow something, but I'm kind of dimly aware of what I'm doing, I'm certainly not aware of how my hand actually does that, right? How I give it a command and it somehow magically follows the command I give it. Like, geez, all that seems to be beyond my consciousness, fortunately. But we can think like that's primarily what it's about, and that's that 5% above the conscious level, right? But there's another drive for consciousness which comes from the roots. I think of it as the spiritual impulse originates within sort of existence as such. It's down there in the deep domain. It's even below our sort of collective psychology, our collective psyche. It's down there in the ground of our being, this domain of being that generally is completely unrecognized, right? In Buddhist terms, that might be something akin to like the Dharmakaya, the very ground of being, the ground of all of our dreams, personal, collective, all the rest. The infinite abyss of being deep down inside. And there's this instinct for consciousness, towards greater consciousness. Something in us is trying to be conscious of itself. And our spiritual yearning is the way that we as individuals sort of, that instinct comes up from a very deep dimension. It comes through our conscious mind, and then we as individuals go, and I hope it gets me this and this and this and this and this too. Right? We feel some yearning, like, where did that come from? But, oh boy, I sure hope I end up in a more peaceful place, and, I can mitigate my suffering to a great degree, and, all the rest. I hope I'm enlightened enough that all my friends and neighbors notice it and acknowledge it. And so we have our personal experience of that yearning, whatever that is for you. It's like your personal experience, what you hope, the hopes and dreams and maybe even expectations that orbit around your own spiritual instinct, however that is felt for you. It's part of what gets you here today, for instance. There's a part of that that's part of that 10% of our consciousness that we're conscious of, that we, like I said, we want to suffer so much. We want to feel more connected, less alienated, all that. But then there's something deep down in the quiet roots of our being. And especially when we encounter that spiritual instinct, before it even really interacts with our personal psychology, it's quite mysterious. Some of you have probably had this experience. It's when that instinct first becomes conscious to you. What I mean by that is it arises from up within you, rather than like your conscious mind kind of read what I call the sales pitch for enlightenment, what it can do for you, and thought, that's pretty good. I think I want that. That sounds really cool. But then there's another way, a much more fundamental way that instinct comes, and it arises, and the ego mind knows that it didn't create it. It receives it. It's the recipient of it. And it can be quite disquieting if it comes in a kind of sudden way. Like, what is that? What just reoriented my life? I don't understand why it came, what it wants, where it's going. And you may run away from it many, many, many times in your lifetime, but what is that has a kind of quiet insistence that doesn't seem to be listening to what we personally want to make out of it? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. That's when you've had that kind of thing, then you kind of have some knowing of, the ego mind is kind of the recipient of something that it didn't create. It receives it, but it didn't manufacture it. Where did that come from? And what does it want? And that's the sort of, it comes from the origin of our being. Something is trying to become conscious within us. Spiritual practice is a kind of way of responding to that. Right? Of kind of saying, okay, I will try to have some intelligent response to that odd and strange and deep yearning, right? And so we take the plunge. And strangely, that in us that wants to wake up, in order to accomplish it, it needs to plunge us down into our being, right? It needs to plunge us down into that which we are unconscious of. As I said, contemplative practice is a way of taking your consciousness down deep into your unconscious. That's what it's really there for.